Welcome, Linda. How are you today?
Hi, thanks for having me, Charity. I'm fine.
So, I wanted to talk to you today about your amazing new book, The River Remembers, and you've won several awards already on this. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. I've always said awards are not important to sell the book, but they really are validating for an author, that's for sure. I've gotten a silver medal in historical fiction from Reader's Favorite and a bronze medal from the International Book Publishers Awards, a bronze medal in multicultural fiction.
That's amazing. I read this book, and I have to say, since I've read your books, all of them, that I like this one the best. And so I know that you write about your family, except for that this one is takes on a whole different thing because you have three different POVs
Mhm.
and they're all from a different cultural perspective.
Mhm.
So tell me about writing that and what made you decide to do it this way.
Okay. It started because in my family tree, I found this woman who'd been born at Fort Snelling in 1835. And I thought, wow, that kind of intrigued me. It seemed like an early time to have somebody born at a fort. And so I researched her. Well, I found out that her parents lived at the fort. Her mother, of course, was an ancestor of mine. She's one of the main characters in my book, married the settler at the fort who basically took care of the store for the soldiers. But what was going on at that time in 1835 at Fort Snelling in Minnesota, which at that time was Wisconsin territory, it was like the clearinghouse for anybody going west came through Fort Snelling. So whether you were a trader or an Indian or a settler or a soldier or a missionary, you came through Fort Snelling. So everybody who was anybody was in that area. And as I researched, I found more and more and more famous names, people who maybe weren't famous at the time, but would become famous. Jefferson Davis, Zachary Taylor, Will Clark from the Lewis and Clark expedition, famous painters like Seth Eastman, George Carlin, even Eliza Hamilton came through that area. So I'm like, okay, this is clearly a place I need to write about, a time that people don't know about that you need to write about. But the story wasn't complete with just my white settlers viewpoint. There was a lot there I could talk about, her wanting to shape her family and her legacy for her child and things like that. That was a great story. But going on alongside with her was the Native American, the Dakota tribes that were being pushed out of the way, but when the white settlers came in, Fort Snelling was built on one of their very holy places. And one of the chiefs had decided that the only way to deal with the white man was to marry his daughters off to white men so that he could teach his family, his legacy, to interact with the white man. So one daughter was married to the Indian agent, one was married to a trader, and one was married to the commandant of the fort.
Mm-hmm.
So all of his grandchildren were half Indian and half white. So one of my point of views is that Dakota chief's daughter that was married to the Indian agent. The third point of view I found was so interesting. In 1835, Harriet Robinson arrives at the fort and she's a slave. She marries Dred Scott at the fort the year later. Well, the Dred Scott decision when they sued for their freedom was a huge decision. It didn't happen until 1847, but a lot of what happened to them while they were at Fort Snelling really played an important part in why they decided to sue for their freedom later on. And I felt that was also an important point of view that needed to be told.
They were all fascinating points of view. And so Day Sets was not a character from your imagination. She was an actual person.
Yes, she was.
Wow.
Now, having said that, there's not much known about her other than that was her name. She was Cloudman's daughter. She married the Indian agent. She had a daughter with him. There really wasn't very much else known about her, so I had to fictionalize it. And being outside my culture, that was a little bit different. So she's kind of an amalgamation of every Dakota woman I could find anything about.
Yeah, I have to say it was really fun reading all of these different perspectives of how people felt about things. Just an interesting time, a lot of changes going with the Civil War coming and all of that. So Linda, did you actually visit Fort Snelling and the surrounding area as you researched your book?
I wanted to. We actually had a trip planned. We were going to go to St. Louis and take a boat. Can't take a steamship up anymore, but you can take a boat up the river to Fort Snelling, and passing all the places along the way that I talk about in the book, Galena, Illinois, and Prairie du Chien, all these places. And I was really excited about doing that. But then COVID hit. So I actually have never been to Minnesota, and I was nervous about writing it. I couldn't put off the book for all the months of COVID. I had to do something. So I wrote it and figured I could always make changes about the setting and the weather and what kind of flowers there are next to the river and that sort of thing. But when I actually finished it, and not having been there, it made me feel nervous. So I found every historical fiction author I could find that wrote anything about that area of Minnesota and sent the book off to them to do a beta reading on it. And luckily, most of them, they all loved it. So apparently I got the setting right enough that they didn't say, "Oh my goodness, how could you have that kind of flower at that time of year," or whatever. So it did help that Fort Snelling has records of the weather, daily weather, all the way back to 1819. So that helped.
You'll definitely have to go there so you can check out the mud.
Yes, definitely, definitely.
So what is going to be your next project?
My next project is another ancestor of mine. I found out actually two ancestors of mine that were from different sides or different parts of my family tree that both happened to be on the Innocents Abroad cruise with Mark Twain, the cruise in 1867 that went to the Holy Land that he then wrote The Innocents Abroad about. So this is very interesting because these two women obviously knew each other on the cruise if they didn't know each other before. And at the end of the cruise, one of them absolutely was in love with Mark Twain and wanted to marry him. And the other one hated him for the rest of her life. So that's kind of interesting and how that happened and how that would work. So the story actually begins when they're getting off the cruise and they're saying goodbye to each other. And a lot of it is done in letters between these two women as their various lives unfold. And yes, Mark Twain kind of weaves his way in and out throughout the story. He does affect them in a kind of a peripheral way, but it's more about them and how they choose to keep going in their lives despite setbacks and how they support each other.
So this next one's going to be more epistolary? Is that how it's going to be?
No, parts of it are, because there are 2 points of view, and one woman's life gets very exciting and interesting, while the other one's is kind of bland. So I figured I'll do that in letters because you don't need to see a bland life in scene, and then they kind of switch, and the other life becomes really interesting and rich, while the other one's kind of like, just kind of killing time for 10 years. So then I do that part in letters. So partly.
So. Any possibility of a spoiler alert? Have you figured out your title yet?
It's going to be called Innocents at Home, because I figured that goes with Innocents Abroad, and here the innocents and they're at home. So that's what I'm calling it.
Oh, I like that.
For now.
Like that. Well, thank you, Linda. It's been a pleasure interviewing you about your fabulous new book, The River
Thanks
Rivers.
Yeah, thanks for having me.